Hi everyone, my name is Karl Forehand, and I'm coming to you from the great outdoors. Welcome to NOMAD 2020. Glad that you're along. I hope you've been enjoying the weekend up to this talk. I'm going to talk to you about Into the Mystic. Carl Reiner said the Christian of the future will be mystic or he will not exist at all. I think all of us have these baskets where we put things into, mental baskets where when something doesn't make sense or we're not sure we want to understand it or we're not sure it's even okay to understand it, we kind of discard those words. We kind of dismiss them as a waste of time. A couple of years ago, I was in a tea shop in Taiwan, and I began during my deconstruction at this tea shop at this time to learn words like presence and start to understand that. And even just while I was there culturally, I saw new symbols and dialects and all these different things that I experienced in Taiwan. And my understanding began to change. I began to open up to different things and to try to understand things a little better that I may have just dismissed or placed them in my basket at times before. And one of the things that happened about the same time is some new music came into my life. One of those people, one of those artists was Van Morrison. And when I heard Van Morrison, I thought, where have you been all my life? And people that love Van Morrison probably said, well, you should have discovered him a long time ago, but I didn't. And I think he just came along right at the right time in my life. And one of his songs is called Into the Mystic. And in that Into the Mystic song, you know, when a poet writes a song, and a lot of those songwriters were poets, and when they would write a song, I think it's important not to try to understand that song too well, because I believe when they wrote those, I know that when I write poetry, and things like that, sometimes I really don't understand what I'm trying to write, but those poets write that stuff down in a way that has some mystery to it. And I think that's most good music. Most good music has some mystery in it because it helps us explore, it helps us imagine through that song, through that poetry, through that art. It helps us to look beyond just the logical things that we can easily understand. My tradition tried not to talk too much about stuff like mysticism, even though the simplest version of mysticism would be experiencing God. And one of the people in my old tradition, named Henry Blackaby, wrote a book called Experiencing God. And in there he talked about how you don't just hear the voice of God through the Bible, you hear it through other things like people and experiences and so on. And so because he wrote that book, and it was titled, they would say he's a bit of a mystic, right? But what is mysticism? About that same time, a couple of years ago, I got to hear a speaker in a Sojourners program called Glenn Young from Rockhurst University. And Glenn said that maybe the simplest definition of it was a direct encounter with God. But since the Reformation, my tradition was discouraging, to say the least, of basing anything on experience. Some may have been irresponsible with experience, but he stressed that it's not just emotion. It's not just when we go to church and we get excited and our adrenaline flows. It's not just that, but it's real experiences, real direct encounters with God. Maybe a more complete definition is this, and he gave this when I heard him speak. He said, mysticism is that part of Christian belief and practice that concerns preparation for, consciousness of, and the effects from the direct presence of God. There is to it a practice. There's a practice, a preparation. I have mixed emotions, to be honest, about practices, creeds, and things like that, because I think sometimes we can cite those, those can be used against people and things like that. But some type of practice, something that facilitates that direct encounter with God, I think is great. I think it's good. and after the COVID crisis is over and all that, and we gather back together, there's going to be something really emotional about getting back together with people. And that'll be exciting, that'll be good, but there's also that solitary part of it that still has to be done in solitude and by ourselves, and it's our practice, it's what we go through. So there's that preparation for, but also a consciousness of, and this is where contemplation and action come together. So we do something in solitude and silence. And by the way, I want to say it's different than quiet time. Quiet time was that rote thing we did that we had to do, that was required. If you weren't doing it, you're almost sinful. It's not that. It's solitude and silence where we get quiet before our Creator. And then that contemplation leads to action. There's that direct flow that comes out of it. It might be our practice might be meditation or just observing nature, or maybe it's a Bob Dylan song. I don't know what works for you, but we move from those sacred places into the divine expressions in the world, and that contemplation and action together is, to me, what mysticism is. And so I'm going to talk today about being, because if most of our traditions talk to us about being not just hearers of the word, but doers only. And by the way, there's a sign-up sheet out in the lobby that you can sign up as you leave. So we experience that. Don't be hearers, be doers. But my friend reminds me sometimes that we're not human doers, we're human beings. And that's maybe the step that we've missed, that we are human beings, and we need to practice just being. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk about being. First point is being with crisis. The COVID-19 crisis will very likely change our world. Right now we're focused around political things and arguing on Facebook, but COVID-19 may cause us to deeply consider what's important and what's not important. We may be able to dismiss it, but nothing like this has ever happened before. We're not going to go back to business as usual. There will be some things that change. My coping strategy has always been to minimize or normalize. And so if I can, I start to kind of minimize things in my head. And you've seen people do that in the media and so on. Or I try to normalize it, make it compared to something I've been through before. But really, it's not like anything we've been through before. And if I can capture it and somehow define it, it won't be as painful, it won't be inconvenient, but this is not like that, right? We can't do that. And adventures, especially things like pandemics, they can't be harnessed. They can't be orchestrated. It's more like walking a tiger than walking the dog. It's not something you're going to put a harness on and tame it. We're going to have to go with it and see what happens. This one is not like any other, but as my friend Dr. Paul says, don't waste a good crisis. Let me just suggest in being in crisis a couple of things. First of all, it's like I say about most everything. First of all, we have to be where we are. Be where you are, and that's presence. Mrs. Beatty was my third grade teacher, I believe, but I don't remember what grade it was, but I will remember that classroom forever. And I remember she used to say, she'd call roll. They don't do that anymore, but she would call out your name, and if you were in your assigned seat that they gave you, you would say here or you say present. Present means something different today. Presence means I'm fully engaged in the right now. Are we here? Are we where we are? Mrs. Beatty, when she would say, are you present? She meant, are you here? Laura, on the other hand, when she says, are you here? She means, are you present? presence is taking a breath and learning to be here. Being right here, right now, is really the only place we can be and the only time we can live in. We have to be where we are. The other thing I would suggest is not just be where you are, but be who you are. There's an encounter in the Bible with Elijah and King Ahaziah, and I call it the drone strike, but it's called the fire from heaven. And when the king questions the prophet of God, and supposedly fire rains down from heaven and takes out people like 50 at a time until they kind of are sorry, and then it gets better. So whether or not you believe that story or not, the disciples believed it because they were questioning Jesus. When after the transfiguration, Jesus sent them ahead to make some reservations for them, and someone treated them with disrespect. And when they did that, the disciples believed, don't we just call fire from heaven? Isn't that what we do? And so when he did that, they said, Jesus said to them, "You don't know what kind of spirit you are." When we don't know who we are, when we're not authentic, we do the wrong things. When we don't understand who we are, we do drone strikes, literally. These disciples are just trying to fit in, and that's what happens when we don't know who we are. When we're not where we are, when we're in the past or we're in the future, or when we don't know who we are, we're trying to fit in and we do things that don't make sense. My daughter had a quote that she had on her Facebook page, I believe, for a little while, so I assume that it's a life quote or something like that. She really never talked to me about it, but here's what it says. It says, "Most people are other people. Their thoughts are someone else's opinions, their life's a mimicry, their passions a quotation." What a sad way to die if that's true about us. Be where we are, be who we are. I have a tattoo on my arm that's some Chinese characters that means real, or it means authentic. And I try to remember that I need to be present, not just be here, but also be who I am. The second point about being is being with nature. I remember a friend of mine and he was the pastor's son, and we were pretty good friends, and after church we would sit outside in the tree, and the sparrows would gather in the trees, and we would use the pellet gun to shoot birds out of the tree. Their white bellies would show up, and we would spotlight them and shoot them. I don't know if it was legal or not in Oklahoma, but that's what we did. And before that, I burned ants with a magnifying glass. And of course, now I care a lot more about animals, and I don't kill animals anymore. I don't even hunt anymore. But something interesting happened to me when I was working at a Kawasaki dealership, Kawasaki manufacturing plant. And so I would get up in the morning, about 5:30 in the morning, and sit in my car and let the car warm up a little bit. And sometimes I would record a little video or something. And as I was sitting out there, the birds would start to sing, and that's partially why I recorded this outside. Those birds would start to sing, and I remembered that bird in the tree that we were shooting out of the tree with the pellet gun. And it surprised me that I was sitting in the car listening to the birds sing every morning. We have a robin's nest up in the corner of our porch, and we wait for those babies to be born every year, and we watch that happen. And it happens like clockwork. You can just depend on it. Even when that nest got knocked down once, the mother just began rebuilding it. We were trying to help her out and putting it back up there, but she began rebuilding it just like clockwork. There's rabbits and squirrels, and they're a little bit more elusive. We don't see them as much. But you might even see a snake or a mole or a butterfly, and all those things are part of nature. part of what I miss about hunting is the sitting in the tree stand. I would sit in the tree stands in the morning. I miss that time of the morning because the animals would, as you sit in the tree stand, you get there before light and you try to be still. And then when the sun starts coming up, the animals some of them start their rounds. They come out of the tree or wherever they were. Some of them are kind of coming home from the night shift or whatever, however you want to look at that. But it's just a lot of sounds. And at this one place, an owl would swoop down out of the tree and scare me half to death. But it's not just the diversity of those animals and all the different things that you see and hear, but it's almost like that nature has a drumbeat to it, and it's just steady. It's like an ancient pattern, and that ancient pattern in nature seems like authenticity to me. Every part of nature seems to know, listen, what it is and where it is. Nature doesn't have a problem with authenticity and presence. They're totally present and they're totally authentic. Like I said, that robin's nest got dislodged, but the mother wasn't distressed or depressed. I don't think, anyhow. I can't read a bird's mind, but she didn't seem like it. When confronted with the change, she just adjusted. And she got back on that drumbeat and began to rebuild the nest. I look at the soil and all the nutrients that the animals and us need is in the soil. And it's taken up into those plants. There's minerals like calcium and zinc and iron and magnesium. There's amino acids that turn into proteins. There's carbohydrates that give us energy and phytonutrients. And it's all there in those plants. And it all comes from the soil. But how does it get in the soil? Well, it gets in the soil, one way it gets there is from my compost pile. When the things that I discard and things die, the plants die, and then they begin to decay, and then they're acted upon by nature, and that is used to bring other things to life. You might call it like a circle of life, but I like to think of it more as a choreographed dance. And it helps us catch a glimpse of how death leads to resurrection and resurrection leads to new life. Being with nature reminds me where I am and who I am, and that it's all enough. It not only reminds me that there's a rhythm and a dance to all this, but I peer down at the soil and I look at the soil, and just for a moment my mind is able to almost comprehend that universal and cataclysmic dance of the universe. And that's where I find my humility these days. That's where I find truth. And it's where I draw energy from, because it's where I find life. Being with pain. It was a friend of mine the other day that said she had done yoga for 99 days in a row. The interesting thing was that when she said that, because I know a lot of people started yoga at the beginning of the year with other exercise programs, nobody said me too. So, including me. It's hard. I love yoga. I love some exercise, I like to walk. But it's hard at first. My mind kind of went back to two-a-day practices when I was in high school football, and you would probably work through the summer and do hard physical labor, but then also you had to go to 2 practices a day, and literally it just wiped you out. You couldn't do anything else because there was so much pain. But everybody knows that. They know often there's a few days of pain, and then after a few days you can walk further, you can lift more weights. It's painful at first. But we also have pain from emotional issues, and we have trauma in our life. And we we don't, it's not that we get out of shape mentally, but it's that we've buried those things. And we didn't know how to deal with them at the time. Maybe that happened to us when we were young, that we had some trauma, and we didn't have the skills to deal with that thing that was happening, and so that's trauma that's kind of buried inside of us. So if we don't deal with that, um, eventually it's going to misbehave. Eventually we're going to have some trouble in our life, and things will come out sideways and cause more pain, because we don't deal with that. In the way that we do, if we don't exercise, if we don't deal with our unhealthiness, if we don't do something about that, eventually it's going to cause us a different kind of pain. And that's kind of how life works. So what do we do with pain? How can we be with pain? Um, well, we could quit. You know, I quit a couple of times when I was playing sports. I've quit exercising, but when we do that, it really doesn't help us. You know, if we quit exercising, it hurts to walk up the stairs. You know, that hurt will come back in a different way. So quitting, running away from it really doesn't work in the long run. We can also numb it or bypass it, or we can use religion to bypass. We can bypass it with religion. We'll do other things, keep ourselves busy, ignore the pain, but it just comes back. It just makes itself evident later on. Really, the only way we can deal with pain is to lean into it. And maybe I want to suggest just being with it. Through processes like focusing, we can be with that trauma and be with it with compassion and deal with our inner child and things like that. Once I participated in the practices, the 2-a-day practices, and I know this lady that did 99 days of yoga. By the end, it was still a little painful to lean into it, but by the end of the 90 days, she was in a lot better shape. And she talked about how her knees felt better, and her hip felt better, and all of those things. Our pain may never go away. Our internal pain or trauma doesn't just get eradicated. But when we can be with it, when we can be with it with compassion, then we're able to use it to our advantage. We're able to live with it. And it's okay to be where you are and who you are once you lean into that pain. Being with the divine. So I'm excited to be to this point. This is where I've been trying to get to all along. But being with the divine, and every morning I wake up, and the other day I was upset because Laura had woken up early, or I was up late or something. We ended up at the same time, and the dog needed to go out all of a sudden, and there were videos playing in the background and all kinds of things. It's nobody's fault. But, it just wasn't what I usually experience. But eventually, I quieted down, and I got rid of how I was so full of myself, how we get. And I was able just to relax and find that place of rest that I always find. Listen, I know I'm not the greatest speaker in the world, and I'm just sharing with you a part of my heart today. But what I would share with you, during COVID-19, we realized that we need connection. There's nothing more important than our connection with each other and our connection with the divine. Make sure and understand me, I'm not saying that we need to go to church, because we don't always find connection in church. I think sometimes I've found connection better at a bar or at work or somewhere else, and not always in church. That may be the default, that may be the thing we think of, but a lot of times we just go and see a show and we bypass any real connection at church, especially as big as they are anymore. It's hard to find true connection unless you're absolutely looking for it. But I find connection with people almost everywhere. But my connection with the divine I find mostly in solitude. And there's just absolutely nothing more important to me than that. Connecting to the source, to God, the Creator, however you define that, that connection is hardwired into us. We need connection. We like to connect to whoever's in charge, and sometimes we substitute our connection with the divine for, connection with important people that we assume in our minds will get us where we want to go, or someone that can help our career, and those kind of things. But connection to God was difficult in the thing that I was raised in, the tradition I was raised in, because they said God was out there somewhere, and it was kind of hard to get to, and we would circle up and we'd petition him for things that I thought any good father would want to give us. We begged him for mercy, even though he was supposed to be full of mercy. But what I've been discovering lately, and many of you listening probably already know this, that I've been discovering that God is everywhere, that God is in every molecule, that God is not just everywhere, but that includes us, that he is in us. And the way of connection, how do I connect to God? How do I reach him? The way to reach him is to go within. And when we go within, we find the divine there. The Cloud of Unknowing, the book by the unknown author, says you can't think your way to God. You can't think your way to God. God is love, and God has to be felt. We have to experience the divine. We have to experience him. We don't experience a lover by analyzing them. These days, my experiences are more like sitting and meditating. I don't know if that's the right word for it. It might be contemplative prayer. It might be centering prayer. And it might be a combination of all those things. It really doesn't have a name, or it doesn't have a label. But releasing my expectations. It's almost like when I hold Laura's hand, that when we're not necessarily doing anything, or I'm not expecting anything, or we're not going anywhere, we're not saying anything, but when I can hold her hand and I feel that love between us, that's sort of what it's like. Being with the divine is less like taking a class and more like taking a break. It's less like a high that you get on from some kind of music, but it's something like authenticity that's already been there, that's always been there. It's like something ancient that's within us. It's less like taking a trip and more like coming home. It's like being where I am, and it also means being where God already is. It's being who I am, and it's recognizing that I already possess this love, and I become what I've always been, a unique imprint of the divine. I can't tell you what practices to have, or how to get there, or what's going to allow you to go within. But I would suggest to you that connection is very, very important. Like I said, we've learned that from COVID, that nothing matters more than connection. We need it. It's hardwired into us. But also, even more than that, even more than connecting to people, we need to connect with the divine. I hope you'll make that a priority. So back to Van Morrison's song. Van Morrison's song was probably a love song. Because he's a poet, because he's a songwriter, we don't really know for sure. I can, search it online and get 100 different opinions about what it was about. But I'm pretty sure it was a love song. he was sailing to meet his love or sailing off with her. It was mystical. He longed, mystics. We long to be home with the one we love. With the mystical, we long to feel the sweet embrace. It's so much like connecting with God, with the divine. I don't think we should be afraid of experiences anymore. I think those experiences, God is experienced most vividly in relationship, not in our theology. You will hear all of that this weekend. You're going to hear some good theology, but also I want you to hear about the experiences of people, because that's just as important. I kind of describe myself as a mystic these days, probably just because I'm more interested in these things than I used to. Part of my journey is trying to put language with what I'm learning. And some of you that hear this, that are listening to these recordings, will most likely want that. You want some language for the things you're discovering. But understand, this is what I've been learning over the past few years, is that some of our experiences, part of our journey, is mystery and paradox and actual encounters that we can't describe. It's like the love song. It's like the poets were trying to tell us. It's really hard to explain, and it's really hard to put into words. The best part of relationships, like marriage, only get muddied sometimes when we try to describe them. Love songs are poets trying to put into words what they know they're not going to be able to adequately describe. That's part of the dance, is that they're trying to describe something that can't be described, but they're longing to try to tell you about what they felt, what they experienced. I hope our experiences are more like an outward flow than something we try to articulate too much. I hope that, like Dr. Young said, that as we have divine encounters, that'll flow out of us. And how about this? Let us float into the mystic. Hey, thanks for joining me on my back porch during the COVID crisis. And I hope you check out all the other speakers and listen to their stuff. If you want to go find where everything I have is, it's at desert-sanctuary.com. You can get to anything I do from there. I do have a new book out called The Tea Shop that I hope you would read, and I alluded to it a little bit today, but I hope you check it out and check out all the other speakers. We've tried to share our hearts with you in this conference and to give of ourselves, to do something for you and with you, and I hope that's been good for you. If I can do anything for you, please contact me, and I'll do my best to help, or I'll find somebody that can. And we hope you're faring well in the crisis, that you're dealing with your self-care and the things you need to deal with during the crisis, and that you're connecting with the divine. And maybe this is a time in your life where you found out some things are important and some things aren't, and you've weeded some of those things out, dealt with yourself, your self-care, spent time with the divine, and connected with others. And let's stay on the journey together.